So, the reason that SFSS is here and is going to be here at the beginning of these meetings, as Thomas pointed out, I really appreciated his presentation this morning. He reinforced what we already know to be true by putting some real results out there, which is that even though San Francisco Unified is a district that takes pride in a lot of the efforts it's making, a lot of the progress it's making, we still are suffering from the same dilemma facing public education across this nation. And that dilemma is that public education is just one more manifestation of a country that is built on a legacy of slavery, is built on a legacy of white privilege. And so what we need to do is when we enter into any effort, so here you all are beginning a journey with RTI, behavioral RTI. There's some great work that you folks are going to be introduced to, that you're going to recognize you're already doing, and that you're going to take up. And if we do this shy of using a cultural competency lens, shy of looking through a priority lens of equity, then what we're going to find is that we will have short-term solutions that will just find a different way back to the status quo. So SFSS is here. I'll be here with you all at the beginning of each of the meetings as a way of putting some groundwork in place so that you can take this equity lens to the work that you're going to do with your RTI team. So I just want to, first of all, can I see a show of hands? How many folks have either been at a training or done some work with SFSS before? Okay, so there's a lot of hands that just went up. And I want to be really clear. Some of the stuff that we discuss and we bring to the table is going to be work that you may have started before, that you may have seen before. And that's okay. It's okay for two reasons. First of all, the work of transformation is continuous and constant. Anybody who has said, I went to the equity training, check, missed the point. Furthermore, our work is not just on an individual basis. One of the things we're trying to do as a partner with SFUSD is to calibrate some common language across the district. So it's great when a school is taking up a priority of equity, and it's even better and their progress and their process is further supported if that work is happening in other places of the district as well, including with the district office, including with the Board of Ed. So what we're trying to do is calibrate some common language. And so having you all here and having this language be a lens through which you look at your RTI work is part of that effort. So I want to read our mission real quickly. SFSS's mission is to interrupt and transform current and systemic educational inequities to ensure all students have access to personalized, equitable, and high-performing schools that believe and demonstrate each student can, should, and will succeed. You'll notice some words are highlighted. And in particular for today, we're going to be focusing on the first highlighted piece, which is to interrupt and transform. SFSS believes that as a nation, we have all the technology. And when I say technology, I'm not talking about computers. I'm talking about curriculum, pedagogy, knowledge. We have all the technology we need to educate all students equitably. And yet we don't. And so if all we're striving to do is to tweak what is already in place, we may be in an unaware place of being part of the system which we think we're trying to interrupt. Thank you. So why transformation? As I mentioned, we work from the assumption, from the knowledge, from the history, from the belief that our society is built on a legacy of colonization. And even though when we talk about equity in this country, we sometimes, when it gets close to home, say, that wasn't me, that was 200 years ago. I didn't kill the Native Americans. I didn't have slaves. And yet, what we are suggesting is that those weren't isolated moments in time. That part of our history was the beginning of a compounded impact on the very design of our public institutions, on the very design of our societal values and priorities. And one of the last public institutions we have is public education. And so this history of belief, of values, of experience have been building up over time. So sometimes we're making decisions about how we're going to respond to students, how we're going to support students that we think are in the moment and don't recognize are built on the knowledge we already have, the experiences we've already had. And those knowledges and that knowledge and those experiences are built on other decisions, other design. And ultimately, they come from a system that was designed to reproduce the status quo. If we look back at the history of public education, schools were not originally designed to get the results we're putting out there that are our intended results of equitable education. Schools were designed to prepare the elite and educate the elite and to prepare the mass to serve the elite, to be their workers. Some of the very systems in place that we're just tweaking go back to that design. But what we also know is that we, as Thomas pointed out, we are products of this system. How much of this has been internalized for us? We are in a very progressive school district that says it seeks to interrupt the status quo. And yet, every one of us, by the mere fact that we are here, to some extent experienced success in the system we're trying to interrupt. At the most invisible place, in the most invisible place, that means we are trying to interrupt not only what worked for us, but by transference would work for our own children. And so unless we are taking the time to do some very, very honest, open reflection and deconstruction, we too, in all of our good intentions, will find ourselves being reproductive. So as you move into doing this work, your behavioral RTI work, the question that I will constantly be here posing is, how do we know that what we are designing is truly meant to interrupt the status quo versus reproduce it? James Baldwin really put it in a much more succinct way. We are trapped in our history, and our history is trapped in us. When we talk about interruption and transformation, what we're really talking about is liberation. Not just liberation for our students, but quite frankly, liberation for us as we exist in the system. So part of the work that SFSS has been doing is to create a conceptual framework for individual and institutional transformation. And today what I'd like to do is to walk us through a very complex framework and show you what we're using to guide the work that we'll be doing together. So this work, when we talk about transformation and the need for transformation, it's sort of like the word equity. Transformation, equity, cultural competence. I mean, we've got tons of buzzwords that we throw out there that we don't always take the time to make meaning of. Even if we think we have meaning of it, we don't always take the time to share and calibrate meaning of. And so with transformation being that that's in our mission statement, we felt it was important to unpack what that looks like, what that means. So I'm going to walk us through 4 phases of transformation that we think are necessary in our schools. So the first phase is the box that's at the bottom. And in that first phase, it's called stance and schema awareness. This is just about awareness. This is about self-assessment. And we suggest that this is important because it's really inefficient to try and transform to something if we haven't taken the time to be very clear about that from which we are transforming. And I'm going to speak more about these in a moment. The second phase, once we have an idea of like what our current reality is, what is the context, like what is the problem we're trying to solve? How do I fit in that problem? Only then can we start to create the conditions for us as a community to have interruptive and catalytic experiences. Now I want to be really clear. SFUSD did not invent transformation. Human beings transform. It's called evolution. And that's the good news. The challenge for us, however, is in the context of our work, we are not transforming nearly quickly enough for the students that are in front of us every day. And so we are suggesting that we need to create the conditions in our schools to be able to professionally, respectfully interrupt the inequities that are playing out. We sometimes foster these false dichotomies. An example of a false dichotomy that's prevalent in schools is, should we love our kids? Or is it more important to love our kids or to be really rigorous teachers? The best schools in this country do not have that choice. Another false dichotomy is, do we create conditions to interrupt the inequities, the inequitable practices that we as individuals or as a system or as a school or as a community are perpetuating? Or do we respect the adults to be professionals? We've somehow pitted these two against each other. In my experience, in my professional experience, I have felt most respected when people push me to change and to grow and challenge me. Once we've created the conditions for that to happen, we don't jump right back into saying, okay, so what are we going to do about this? One of the most important conditions that we have somehow really pushed against in education, ironically, is space for people to reflect and learn. We are responsible for the education of so many, and yet we constantly push back on the adults having space to be in a learning place. And so we need to make meaning. And so we need to create space, structures, commitments for adults to come together and make new meaning. We need to be able to deconstruct. After something's been interrupted, we can say, thank you for the interruption. And then if we just go back to some actions, we're going to go back to what we know. And so we need time to deconstruct our meaning, our schema, how we make meaning of what the situation is. And together, individually, sometimes outside of our sites, we need to make new meaning. And only then can we then take some action, and a different action. And I want to be really clear, just because we get to the place of taking action doesn't mean the problem's solved. Frequently, action will lead to another interruption or catalytic experience. Frequently, a new action is going to lead to us screwing up. Why are we going to do that if we have conditions that punish us for trying to do things differently for improvement and then get slammed down if we make a mistake? Frequently, a new action will lead us to needing to make more meaning. But ultimately, what we're hoping is that these new actions will lead to different results and a complete shift in our schema, a complete shift in the results that we see for our students. So this is a very simplified version of what that cycle looks like, and then there's tons of work that has to happen underneath it. This year for you all, we're going to just be focused on these very first two: schema awareness, self-awareness, conditions to open up interruptive and catalytic experiences. So if we move to the next slide, when we talk about the stance and schema awareness, this question of how do we show up in the skin we are in? What is our current reality? How do we play into that? So I'm going to keep asking people to think about what is your current reality in your school? Who are your least reached students? Some schools are small enough that you can actually name them. Some schools have patterns right now that exist of who they know how to educate and who they're not doing such a good job with educating. Some schools, you have to think about those patterns over time. But who are those students? How do you fit into that in the skin you're in? Do you have a similar experience of those students? Do you not understand those students because you came from a different experience? Are you in relationship with those students in their communities in a way where you're actually listening to what their experience is? How much of the dilemma of your least reached students do you actually understand? What is your understanding? How do you fit into it? And some of the ways that we figure this out, and we do this is, like I said, we look at the patterns, but we also look at the data on an ongoing basis. And when we talk about looking at data, I know that ever since No Child Left Behind, school districts have been amazing at looking at data and naming what couldn't be named before. And even that, we have figured out a way of bringing such a level of bureaucracy to that we don't have time to really dig to the root issues. So when you're looking at data, are you doing it because you have a short period of time to just understand the data, or are you having the very difficult, the very courageous heart-to-heart conversations about what the root causes for those results are? So are we able to, at the end of the data, looking at our data, are we able to say what the data says, or are we able to say what the data means for who we are as practitioners? And then also we want to ask ourselves, like I said, in the skin we're in, how do we play into it? What's our operant theory? How do we walk into school? How do we make meaning of school? Do we do what we know? Do we do what worked for us? Or are we in a constant cycle of humility to say, and I am open to learning from others, including my students themselves, about what I need to do differently? Usually, it's somewhere along the spectrum. What's the operant theory of our school? And when I say the operant theory, I'm not talking about what is our espoused mission. If you're wondering what the operant theory of a school is, ask a new person who's in the school, who hasn't read anything but is just experiencing the school. What are the norms of this school? What are the messages you have heard? How do things work here? Before they become part of that system, new people are trying to figure that out. Are those operant theories at play for the sake of making the life of adults more sustainable, which is not unreasonable, but it's a different goal? Next slide, please. Oh, let me go back. I'm sorry. Can we go back to the last slide? I'm just going to say one thing with this last piece about the operant theory. Tomorrow we're going to do some work. And the work we're going to do is we're going to explore a little bit about who we are in the skin we're in so we can understand how we show up. I want to actually, just to make meaning of this, share how I might answer that question. Like when I show up, people see me and they see a white, bald, guy of power, guy of positional influence. I sign people's paychecks. All that matters. All that matters. And there's other stuff about me that people don't see that actually influence very much how I show up. So I'm going to read a little poem I wrote once. I am Gregory Peters. I am the child of parents who prioritized service and respect and family itself. Parents with the wisdom of humility, inquiry, and critical consciousness. I am of a family whose education reaches back to the lineage of our ancestors and culture, and who collectively defines and measures intelligence not solely through our brains, but also our hearts and passions and hands. I am an American of proud Lebanese and Italian heritage. I grew up on food stamps. I am married. I have been married 4 times to the same man. I am queer at a time when my queer students are still dying by their own and others' hands and influence everywhere. So I'm a very complex person. I'm not just this white guy. The skin I'm in is so much more than the skin you see, and yet the skin you see is so much of who I am. For in the context of educating our least reached youth, I am still a white man. I offer that so that you can understand, like, this came as a result of sitting in and saying, who am I and how do I show up? So I know my passions, my experiences show up with me. And I know when I'm not consciously reflecting and aware of that, I have been trained as such a piece of this dominant culture that no matter how queer I am, no matter how poor I was, no matter how brown some of my family is, when I'm unaware, I know that I will use my white privilege to make me comfortable. And that happened in my classroom. It happened with me as an administrator. It happens with me every single day. And so my work has to be constant. So that comes from just doing some work about my schema. So the question is, what's your schema? Part of my schema is that when I was in the 7th grade, I got passed on to algebra. And I went home and I was all proud and I told my mom, hey, I'm in algebra. And my mom's response to me, my mom did not graduate high school. My father graduated high school, my mom did not. My mom has a GED. Her response to me was, I'm done. And I was like, what? She said, you are officially smarter than I am. I can't help you. My mom loves me. She was not looking for a way to give up on me. This is that piece about her lineage and the messages that had been told to her as a high school dropout actually played out and interfered with her love of her child and her engagement with his education. I'm telling you that story this year in my 50th year of life. That means it's still playing out for me. Am I aware of that when I'm in schools, when I'm dealing with families, when I'm dealing with students? What are you aware of? What are you not aware of that plays out every day? So now we'll go on to the next slide. So when we talk about the interruptive and catalytic experiences, the question is, how do we disrupt our mental models, these schemas that we have? And so there's some conditions here that we've put out there. This is some of the work that we're working with pupil services on around how do we support schools to be places where we can actually engage in discourse, where we can not only say, here's how our school works, here's who I am, and here's how I play into it, but here's what we need in order to create learning spaces to disrupt that. And so just a couple of things here are the personal organizational commitment, where we need to have clear expectations. Everyone, like, you need to hear walking into a school, this is what we're about. We're going to have an open door policy. We should be able to walk into each other's classrooms without notice, just for the sake of being a critical friend. What are some of the shared agreements of that community? We are going to have hard conversations, and so when the hard conversations go too far and we've done harm, we're going to use restorative practices, even as adults. I'm not saying these are the ones you have to take up. I'm saying, what are the ones that you have to take up? Are you clear about that? Are you sharing that with the person before they're hired so that they don't come on board and say, I didn't sign up for this? These are the conditions for you to accelerate your courageous conversations. You need to have constant community and trust building. I hate when people call community building touchy-feely work. We keep talking about